This is Criteria. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Criteria. I am James Majewski here with my co-host Thomas V. Maris. What's up, Thomas?
Hey, James.
And we are joined today by our guest co-host Nathan Douglas. Hey, Nathan.
Hey guys, great to be here.
And that means that we're back on the Malick train. We are going through all of Malick's films. Next on the docket is Voyage of Time, Life's Journey, a sort of experimental nature documentary about the cosmos. There's two versions, the IMAX Experience and then the longer one.
Which is Life's Journey.
Yeah, Life's Journey. That's right. Okay, good. So, we're talking Voyage of Time. Shorter one, narrated by Brad Pitt. Longer one, narrated by Cate Blanchett.
And this came out in 2016.
2016.
Yeah, and there's also a third version reportedly that few have seen that Malick prefers with no narration at all. I think that one also is feature length. It is worth mentioning that these films are a bit hard to see at the moment. You know, I think the short version, if I remember correctly, was streaming for quite a while on Mubi. But right now, it doesn't seem to be. You can get, I think, the long version, if I remember correctly, in a DVD or Blu-ray on Amazon, but it is not in the U.S. region. So you'd have to have like a region-free player to play that. Now, we were able to see these films, and we leave it to either the passage of time to make them more available or for the enterprising listener to find a way, as indeed life doth, according to Steven Spielbergius.
Yeah, but and it is worth saying that this film does receive screenings every once in a while.
Yes, that's true.
My first time seeing the film, the longer Cate Blanchett narration one, was in a theater. So, keep an eye out. But
you will be able to see them at some point, listener.
Yeah. Another thing worth noting is that there is a newly released Malick biography, right? That I think, Nathan, you've had a chance to read or are reading?
Yes, I finished reading it earlier this week.
Nice.
It's a new biography called The Magic Hours, The Films and Hidden Life of Terrence Malick. I'll just hold it up for the camera for those watching. And it's by John Bleasdale, who I believe has done some other biographical writing. I'm not 100% familiar with his whole output, but it's quite a significant step in Malick biographies, because I think it's actually the first kind of really comprehensive stab at it. Malick is notoriously hard to do biography of, partly because of just how much he shies away from media and from interviews. So the book is largely drawn from a lot of existing media out there already, going all the way back to the early 1970s. Really, I guess up to Badlands when Malick released his first film. And maybe the biggest kind of feature of it is that it has a lot of interviews with Malick collaborators. There's definitely insights in it. I recommend it for anyone who's interested in reading about Malick. It's kind of a must-have because there really isn't anything else that covers his whole life, and there are some new details in there that are definitely worth absorbing.
Nice. Yeah, and I was being kind of glib in my description of the film. It is experimental. And it does have a lot of similarities with a nature documentary. But, if you've seen Tree of Life, you kind of know what that's getting at, because it has a lot to do with the sort of Genesis cosmic sequences.
Yeah, it's very much an expansion of that.
Yeah, and even if they aren't the exact shots, the feel is very similar.
Yes, for sure.
So it's almost as if Malick takes that impulse that's present in Tree of Life and then just, runs with it.
And this is a project that he had been apparently wanting to do for a few decades. It has. I didn't have a chance to read up about the origins too much, but it has its origins in a project called Q that he was thinking about in the 70s, which I think I read started out with the idea of tracing his he's of Persian descent, and he wanted to trace his Persian prehistoric ancestors or something, and it was quite a different thing in its original conception, but eventually became what it is. And but my understanding is he spent a lot of time over the years keeping detailed scientific notes and consulted with scientists a lot for this film. Now, this is not like the narration of this film is more of a kind of like an existential nature rather than a scientific one. But he did, for the actual imagery and the photography, he did, and sort of like the development of the Earth and life, he did consult with scientists very carefully, and they actually did use scientific instruments for some of the images that then they like painted and made more attractive and stuff. The other thing interesting for Catholics is right at the beginning of each version of this film, as a co-presenter of the film, is Knights of Columbus, which is kind of interesting, and it'll be surprising for anybody who didn't know about their involvement in the film. Unfortunately, I can hardly find any information about this. Now, I had read an article, an overview of Malick by a Dominican friar, Father Timothy Danaher, who I believe is or was one of the co-hosts of the Friars and Film podcast that I've mentioned here before. And he said the origins of Voyage of Time were the Knights of Columbus gave Malick an IMAX grant to make a, quote, family-friendly film. And then he used that instead for the nature and evolution sequences in the Tree of Life. And then the Knights of Columbus later called him out on it. So he hastily put together a documentary on the birth and death of the universe. I don't think that this is accurate, given that this was a decades-long ambition of his to make this project. However, I'm curious about the Knights of Columbus part of it. But all the other accounts that I've read say that it was Seven Seas Partnership, a UK-based company, that funded the film. And it was originally supposed to be 3 films, 2 45-minute ones, one of which would have a poetic voiceover and the other which would have a scientific voiceover, and then a feature film. And then they complained that he blew their money on the Tree of Life and the 2 or 3 films following that because he hadn't made their film yet, which he denied was the case. And he claimed that they just hadn't been able to fund it or something. They hadn't given him enough money or something. And it was settled by him just returning their money, basically. But he did make this Voyage of Time thing in the form that we have. So that's kind of the origins of the film. Yeah, I mean, I can just give a quick indication of some of the principal differences. Well, first I'll say that like this film is a little different from a lot of Malick's films, not just in the case that it has this more cosmic scope throughout, but also because he's not working with just one like cinematographer or just like a few actors, you know, on set playing around with the camera and stuff like that. They sent because of the nature of the film, they had to like look all around the world to find locations that would fit like the Earth in a certain form of development, like a place with no trees, for instance. He sent these IMAX camera teams around the world, much in the way, in a sense, in the way that like a Planet Earth or something like that might do it, with multiple teams working and finding the best material. But also there's this other aspect, which is mostly in the longer version, much more prominent in the longer version throughout, is he sent these low-res Japanese cameras out to photographers around the world to just capture kind of pieces of life, like of human life, with like style and technical instructions for how they should do it. And he said, like, you should give some of the time you should be giving the camera to just like random people like in a crowd, or police officers, prostitutes, whatever. Just give the camera to someone and stay by them and watch what they're doing, but just let them get an involved perspective on the events that are taking place. So there's the first scenes are like homeless people on the city streets, and then you've got a lot of scenes around the world of bulls being killed in some like Indonesian religious ceremony, and you've got just all different kind of cultures being on display.
Yeah, and that footage is, I think, completely excised from the IMAX version.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So that's one of the principal differences, but it's also worth noting that the narration is actually different as well. So
right, it's not just 2 different voices.
That's right.
The perspectives are different.
There's definitely some thematic overlap, but Brad Pitt is speaking really sort of from the perspective of like a father to his child.
It's a letter, yeah.
Yeah, and the orientation in the Cate Blanchett one is a little more metaphysical, a little more poetic, addressing this mother right. Earth, a mother like deity. I don't know, it's unclear, but the the result is something that's more than just kind of like superficial difference. The two films really do end up feeling distinct, even though closely related.
Yeah. So I guess I'll open up because you and I watched the shorter version first, although you had already seen the longer version in theater, as you mentioned. So the Brad Pitt version, it's 45 minutes long, and it starts out with the text of this letter to a child, which is then kind of expanded on, I guess you could say, by Brad Pitt's voiceover. And as you said, it's a father reading a letter to his child, and the film is actually framed with, if I remember correctly, framed with shots of this little girl, who only appears at the very end of the longer version, so she's not as prominent. But it's kind of it's very grounded because he's recalling how when he was a child he would lie on the ground and look at the sky and all this stuff, and so he's talking to his child, and he's seeing the world through his child's eyes, evoking this sense of wonder, but also these existential questions. So there's questions about the good. The good is referenced a number of times, and these classic philosophical, metaphysical questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Is said in those exact words. And themes that are shared in the two films: how life began, how mind began. So, like you said, there are thematic similarities, but the orientations are different. And so, with the shorter version, though, my experience was it didn't feel as distinctive, as distinctively Malick in some ways, for a number of reasons. One of which the voiceover itself actually is a little different from his past couple of films because it's a little bit more, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's a little bit more. I mean, the idea is it's a very clear conceit: father writing letter to his child. It's one voice speaking throughout. It's like you kind of, it's pretty obvious what's going on. It's not super ambiguous in the way that, say, the voiceover in like The Thin Red Line is, where you're like not sure exactly who's being spoken to, who's speaking at every moment. And then, but the main difference I would say is you don't feel, for me on one viewing, you don't feel as much the presence of just like the Malick personality in the footage so much. And that's partially because it was these different teams. And there are scenes in both films where you're looking at early humans, for instance. But and in those scenes, the camera there's this kind of like wandering camera, much like in other Malick films we've discussed. But those films are much less prominent. There's a lot less time spent on that material in the short version. And then also just something about, it's beautiful photography, and we expect that from Malick, but something about the way it's strung together doesn't feel as distinctive from like any other, nature documentary I might watch with beautiful photography. And I think part of that is actually the music. Something about the music choices in the first one feels a bit more, I don't know if emotionalistic is the right word. How would you describe?
Well, in the IMAX version, the music choices are very much similar to those that are employed in Tree of Life during some of these sequences. Yeah. So they're orchestral, or they're classical. They're emotive, bombastic. There's like a definite kind of emotional register to each moment. But in the longer version in Life's Journey, oftentimes it'll be kind of like a droning sound of like a single sustained note, or it'll be the tuning of instruments, or, something that's far less, emotionally acute and more...
more mysterious, more textural.
Yes.
And there's plenty of silence.
And it makes space a lot of times for silence. Yes. So that you hear a lot more in Life's Journey. You hear a lot more of the sounds of nature and of whatever it is that you're looking at. Before we go any further, I did want to ask you, Nathan, did we miss anything in teeing this up? Was there anything else you wanted to say at the outset looking at these films? Or do you want to dive in and talk a little bit about the IMAX version like Thomas has just done?
I think just the only overview, we touched on it, but I think it's worth just coming back to in a little bit more detail, or at least to just emphasize how long this project was existing first in Malick's imagination, from the late 1970s, perhaps even as early as before he started shooting Days of Heaven, in the mid 70s. And so, its emergence and its completion really was, it's kind of funny, we're here almost 10 years later, and it's seen, I think, by a lot of people as kind of a curious footnote in the last decade of Malick's, very, very busy, 2010s. But, before it came out, there was a lot of anticipation. Certainly a lot of that was for the Tree of Life, because the Tree of Life, is the culmination of this late 70s, early 80s Project Q. Bleasdale says this in his biography, that it's a reference to the Arabic word qasida, which means ode, and there's this kind of musical, encyclopedic, this everything kind of film is the sense we get that Malick has been working on for so long, and it was what he was working on when he went, kind of went away from the world in that 20-year gap that everyone is so fascinated by. And so for that to finally have its completion, both in the Tree of Life and in Voyage of Time, really was this kind of 1-2. Okay, now we're going to finally see what this is all about. But I think it is just, remarkable that that it didn't come together as one omnibus project. It still kind of had to diverge into one that's kind of more scientifically focused. I think we'll get into this more as we talk about it, but I think it's worth saying this is the project that Malick had been living with for like 40 plus years, and it's maybe interesting to think about whether that fermentation is kind of visible in the final product or not.
I think that it helps one to make sense of some of what he's doing in Tree of Life as well. You could see the kind of cross-pollination that's going on between these projects, because in a similar, albeit different way, Voyage of Time feels, very much like a magnum opus in the way that Tree of Life did. But it definitely has a different sort of thrust to it. He's doing something differently here. But I think that, like Thomas said, the IMAX version feels somehow less Malickian. It feels like it has some of the Malickian edges smoothed over.
Yes.
And it gives the impression, I don't know if this is the case or not, but to me it gives the impression of like, here's what we will release to help make some money off of this. Because this can play in the Natural History Museum's IMAX theater, and it'll have Brad Pitt on the billing, and
who was a producer on the film,
right?
Yeah.
So I think that for the purposes of this conversation, we could probably treat the Life's Journey version as the definitive one, and talk about the differences between that and the IMAX version, sort of as an interesting comparison.
Right.
But I think that the ambition is more, and the Malickian perspective is more apparent in Life's Journey.
And I just want to say too, just as a last point of comparison between the feel of the two films, is that first of all, I think that the second one builds more effectively, and that's true in the music too. It doesn't get into the sort of the emotional symphonic music until later on, whereas it's kind of immediate in the short version, in a way that feels kind of premature and unearned somehow. And then I couldn't say if there's anything about the editing of the actual images that does this, but I just felt much more compelled and much more on the hook at each moment in the longer version. And you'd think, okay, a lot of people struggled with the 20 minutes of cosmic sequence in Tree of Life. So it's okay, now we've got a 45-minute and now we've got a 90-minute version. But I actually found the 90-minute version much more gripping than the 45-minute version as it happens. So aesthetically speaking, I think it's superior in almost every way. There's some respects in which I prefer the content of what's said in the voiceover in the short version to the longer version, which we can get into later. But other than that, I think we all agree that the longer version is just much more aesthetically compelling?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think I watched Life's Journey first in preparing for this episode, and then watching the IMAX version, it seemed to me that the IMAX version very much felt like a greatest hits, distillation of particularly of, you pointed this out, Thomas, like the music of the climaxes, basically, the structure of Life's Journey is a lot more gradual, as you've been saying. It's very similar in that sense to every film that he made in that period, from To the Wonder to, especially I would compare Voyage of Time most to Knight of Cups. I think they're kind of siblings in this sense, in that there's a structure that is very meandering in its own way, and you're just not quite sure what your bearings are. And then the music, as always in Malick, the music is kind of this grounding force that especially emotionally, that gives you kind of a place to rest and park if you're getting a little tired or unsure of the search that the film is on. And you definitely see this in Life's Journey, throughout. There are these climaxes kind of every, with each act almost. And the IMAX version is just kind of the climaxes all kind of put together with a little bit of material in between to kind of join them. And I think that definitely seems to be like the intentional,
Yeah, it's interesting because the IMAX version is more immediately legible because of the grounding shots of this child in a field. Thomas mentioned that it's bookended, beginning and end, but we return to this child at least once or twice during the 45-minute film as well. So we're reminded of this child's perspective. Whereas in Life's Journey, there is a similar formal return that happens with this occasional sort of fade to black, and then kind of like a beginning of a new act, and also these
returns to humanity.
Yes, these grainy, almost amateurish, sequences of different places from around the world. But even those, are sort of tenuously linked in terms of their content. We see everything from, like was mentioned, poverty, homeless. We see a protest and sort of rowdiness. We see arrests happening,
gardening, ethnic,
a religious procession. So it's sort of like a lot of slice of life flavor.
There's some points at which it feels particularly appropriate. There's a scene where I think maybe the line is, "Who brought it into Cate Blanchett? Who brought me into this world? Who brought us into this world?" or something like that. And it's these scenes of, it's like in India, and there's different idols and it's religious processions, and it seems to be, to me at that moment, to be kind of asking the question of is this what we're to identify the origins of the world to or not? But for the most part, it doesn't feel that targeted in that way.
I have difficulty actually remembering specific pairings of voiceover to images, with the exception of the IMAX version, when the voiceover begins talking about love, and it's these awesome shots of a mama whale and a baby whale just nuzzling, and it's talking about love, moving us, and would there be life without love? And I remember it, especially because it's missing from Life's Journey, and during that sequence in Life's Journey with the whales, it's actually talking about death and sorrow, if I remember correctly. So it's very interesting how there's a real tonal difference with the same sequence between the two films. So going back to the larger point of Life's Journey being a little less legible, a little less comprehensible, this is maybe one of the ways in which it feels more Malickian, because you're like, what is this? Sure.
And what do you?
Can I push back on that for a second?
Okay,
I actually I disagree. I think Life's Journey is more comprehensible than the IMAX version. Particularly with regards, the structure is incredibly simple, with the exception of the modern day, consumer camera footage. The structure is just beginning to end, basically. And I find it particularly striking how how much it follows that, just from the creation of the cosmos to the creation of the earth to the creation, the creation of life, following that all the way up to the dinosaurs, the asteroid hitting, and then early man. And then all of a sudden we have this cut to, what I think is, must be modern day, a field in like probably near Austin or somewhere in Texas that has this, this just a normal field that there's some very modern buildings that are off to the side, and the little.
And we do get
playing.
a couple of shots of like a modern metropolis. Like as soon as the early man builds buildings, then we get this fast track cut to.
It makes this massive
ultra
leap.
modern city.
It's a kind of incredible. It's funny because the film does it kind of so offhandedly, but it's comparable to what Kubrick does in 2001 with the bone becoming a spaceship. All of a sudden we jump 10,000 years to Dubai. To see the.
But if you think about it, that jump is jarring to us because we are sort of closest to it. We have a frame of reference for like how long that represents. But all of the sequences before were also comprised of massive jumps, through history. Because if we're beginning with like the Big Bang or whatever, we're talking about millions, eons of the passage of time as the cosmos is forming and planets are forming and life is appearing and evolving. So it's more striking. It's more, surprising when we see Neanderthals and now we're in this modern metropolis, but it might actually be the smallest jump forward in time that happens in the film. I don't know, but maybe with the IMAX version, I feel like a clearer sense from the beginning of what this is and where we're going, whereas with Life's Journey, even if relatively quickly I can kind of like intuit and understand like, oh, okay, we're moving through history here. To what end is the part that's a little less evident, especially when you have these cuts to, strange scenes of modern life, that seemingly have nothing to do with the moment in cosmic history where I'm finding myself in the timeline.
So what do you guys make of the stylistic difference of those scenes? Why is he using this sort of grainy footage and that kind of thing?
Well, from what I understand, and again, Bleasdale's biography touches on this, apparently, it was kind of the realization of again, an idea that he'd had probably, decades before, or maybe as early as the 90s or early 2000s, where he wanted to do some kind of project giving, disposable or near disposable cameras that an amateur could operate, give them to just people who are not film people, and in some cases, even like in very extreme situations, I think psychiatric patients was like one of the first, ideas for that, give it to psychiatric patients and just kind of see what happens. I think that, it comes down to just that search for the authentic, I think, and the spontaneous, and that we've talked about this a lot in our series, how Malick is always in search of these moments. But one thing that I think is interesting, and I apologize in advance if I'm referencing this biography a lot, the material is very fresh and a lot of it does kind of lend some new insights to the thing. But I just one thing that really stood out to me that is relevant to this is how much, because it goes back to what we were talking about, especially I think in our New World episode, when we were discussing Malick as somebody who is kind of really searching for reality and really trying to be in touch with reality, as opposed to perhaps the more conventional Hollywood, like constructing a kind of reality. It's much clearer to me now just how much Malick is like a full-on Hollywood filmmaker in the classic sense of like creating a world, going to great lengths to create a world that then he can explore. So it's not like, it's not neorealism or documentary realism, but I see this, this camera experiment that he does as, kind of related to that. It's breaking out of that mold. It's something that can't be controlled, even in how Malick apparently directed his nature photography teams to go out and shoot stuff. The instructions were often to still shoot it in the Malick style, which is this moving forward or moving backwards. If the camera moves, it should be it should be on the z-axis. It should be going forward, which even led to situations apparently where, they're shooting on a volcano in Hawaii and, they're getting closer and closer to the crater and the shoes are starting to melt. What do you do in that situation? Or even Bleasdale even makes reference to, the kind of equipment that's needed to do that smooth motion. We're talking like crane, the Thin Red Line, we talked about it was shot like on a very long crane apparatus, to get that particular close to the grass kind of flow. Again, it's interesting to think of. This is not kind of your run out there with a camera and just grab whatever.
Yeah.
Like, it's very, very technically sophisticated. Getting this gear up to these remote locations, like there's a lot. It's astonishing to me the amount of like logistics that must have gone into getting these shots. And I think that's something that maybe we can sometimes miss because we're thinking about Malick as somebody very tied to reality. He is, but it is also, he's doing it in a very, very technically intense way.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think that this juxtaposition does for us, is in introducing these grainy, like spontaneous sequences of daily life. It kind of helps, I think, to connect what I'm seeing elsewhere to my reality. These like really beautiful, crisp, high definition, super, colorful, just amazing images. They have their own kind of reflection. They reflect reality in a particular way, but they can also feel unreal. I don't know if you guys have ever had this experience, but it's like, I'm not even talking about Malick in particular here, but I'm just talking about this sort of category of nature photography that can really strike you in its beauty, but then still somehow feels alien. And then when you come to these grainy sequences, it's a reminder that this inhabits the same universe. This is inside of the same world. This is all contained together. And that graininess, and the like lo-fi quality of the shots conveys that it reflects reality in a different way, but I think the two benefit from each other in the juxtaposition. So there is like a kind of dialogue between these two, because when I'm seeing this grainy, shot of a fire and the firemen are arriving and then the camera is like sort of moving in on the flame, I'm investing it, imbuing it with everything that I've been carrying with me from these shots of the volcanoes. It's informing the way that I'm seeing that, and then vice versa. So I think that there's like a fruitful exchange between these sequences, but it's one of the things that stands out as an example of its experimental quality. You might look at those sequences, and if you don't probe it a little bit, just be kind of befuddled. Like, oh, what's he trying to say? What's the point here? But if you look at the impression that those sequences are able to sort of create, the feel, and what even just like the formal qualities of this footage are able to express or convey, I think then that's getting more toward like the kind of attitude I think you need to adopt in watching this, almost watching it as though it were a work first of visual art. And I think that this is one of the things that I find most delightful about the film, both versions, but in particular Life's Journey. It's just a feast for the eyes, to use the cliche. It's like so delightful to watch. And for anybody who would like to kind of exercise this muscle to sort of learn to watch film kind of with a more detached eye, like one would look at a painting, I think that this is a great starting point, because it gives you enough to kind of like keep you engaged. You're not completely left on your own, but you can just sort of like lean back and just take in the image and what's going on with the image and with the rhythm of the cuts. That's another thing that stands out. I think if you're attentive to the rhythm of these different sequences in the way that he's cutting, sometimes it feels like just like a total onslaught. Like I'm not staying with any one image, long enough. And it's not because it's especially fast, but it's somehow not commensurate to the immensity of what's being shown me. And it's just hitting me. I'm going on a bit of a digression, but hopefully I'm making my point clear, which is that I think that this is a really good film to watch with a kind of letting go of the need for narrative or for goalposts, and to just sort of enjoy the images that are happening on screen. In a lot of ways, it reminds me, you brought up 2001 Space Odyssey already. It reminds me of a Kubrick film in places,
what did you say when we were watching?
I said, oh man, it puts Kubrick to shame. But you'd like to think that Kubrick would be super excited to watch this, because it's really not like anything. Let me rephrase that. Like it's almost like Kubrick anticipates a film like this being made. He's able to intuit what's possible.
And you're talking about like the cosmic sequence maybe at the end of 2001, for instance.
Yeah, and at the beginning.
And at the beginning,
yeah. I think that, or like the evolutionary sequence at the beginning, yeah. Right. But both, yeah, certainly. And I think that what this film stands out in being able to draw you in to a way of looking at the world that is distinctly cinematic. It has to be a moving picture.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting too, because I did talk about Planet Earth and stuff, but one big difference in the footage is that, like, sure, this is telling a story, but it's mostly a contemplative gaze of the camera.
Yes.
And not an action-packed chase sequence from one animal of another or something. It's not this kind of like, it's Planet Earth is very much entertainment, at the end of the day, but this is a bit different.
And also it's worth noting that some of these cosmic sequences in space do basically amount to elaborate paintings.
Yes.
They're special effects that are wrought, I'm sure, utilizing a lot of computer technology as well, but also practically, and so they are sort of creating these little works of art that then they're able to film in, beautiful ways. And the result is something that there's just no other way of seeing,
Right.
Yeah, it's astonishing actually to consider, especially just what you said, James, like the cosmic imagery. A lot of it is, of course, is based on real life reference material, like, images from the Hubble Space Telescope. And apparently there's a satellite. I didn't know this until, yesterday, but there's a satellite that's like, taking 4K imagery of like the sun, which I found incredible. Like that's the coolest thing I've learned this week. Anyway, because when I was watching the sun, there's sections of the film that are dealing with the surface of the sun and sun flares, and yeah, sure we have. I'm it doesn't surprise me that we'd have images to reference of that, but I was still astonished by kind of the images that Malick produces, and thinking a lot of this must be imaginative, and it turns out. No, actually, it wasn't as imaginative as I thought. But anyway, the point I was trying to get to is that there's something really incredible about how much these cosmic images were created through very, essentially a bunch of guys like in a dark studio doing some abstract, awesome. Painting in liquid with water, just all the. I won't go into all of it, but just all the materials that they're kind of just throwing at the wall, metaphorically, though. Who knows? Maybe they did that literally too. It's incredible. Like, and the association, like there's such a rich, such a richness of association, and the power of how easy it is for us to really read, the beautiful reality, into these abstract
Yes.
shapes, and then Malick, of course, is a master at positioning everything. Him and his editors are just amazing at positioning everything so that we can make those associations smoothly. I don't know. There's a lot there. I don't think I can do justice to it just talking about it like that. But there's, to me, again, it's more fuel for the fire of the Malick heads who are kind of see him as I do, as this kind of, as a filmmaker who's encompassing the whole spread of like kind of what's possible in filmmaking. It's not only realism. It's not only abstract art. It's not only the technical apparatus and the insane logistics that requires, like, he's kind of got his hands in every pocket of like, what filmmaking can be as a thing. And it's all coming together. I guess maybe the remarkable thing is that it's not ever, kind of for anything less than wonder in the proper sense,
Yes.
and like drawing our attention to the wonder of reality itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And one last thing I'll say is just on this subject is like, this is one of the great pleasures of this film. I really liked watching both versions, but in particular Life's Journey. I agree that it's more gripping. In both cases, the great pleasure came from just like getting to like watch these images, and the beauty of them, and aware both of the fact that in some cases a reality is being captured, and in other cases it's being if not imagined, it's like
Invented.
I'm glad that they had the good sense to do so many of these special effects practically, because there's just like a richness to them that you can't get with computer generated special effects.
What was the most striking image?
Easy for me. It's when the primitive man is looking at his reflection, but if I'm understanding this shot correctly, I think the camera is submerged under the water and we're seeing up out of the water at him. We're not seeing the reflection in the water. I don't know if I'm correct there, but
that was
I think
my
that's
interpretation.
right.
Yeah. But the impression is, I'm seeing his reflection. He's seeing his reflection and I'm seeing it with him. And I think it's one of the most beautiful shots of Malick's career. And there's just it's a great face with a great prosthetic. There's just something in his eyes and in the movement of the water.
Yeah.
It's just really well observed. So yeah, far and away, that's my favorite image.
Yeah, that's a great one. I loved all the early man stuff, and we can talk about that a bit more. But as far as like the painterly stuff, I mean, there were a few that kind of like, when I saw it, I was just like, yeah, it's tasty. But in particular, there was an image, and I don't know at what point in the film this is. It's kind of like you're seeing like a rock surface with some holes and like water bubbling out and spraying and sort of like falling in some of the other holes. And it's just like, there was something just extremely like kinetically satisfying about that bit that it was just like, yeah. Like,
you're not talking about the underwater lava? The lava coming out?
No, that was one of them. That was one of my favorites.
Yeah,
I wasn't talking about that, but the lava coming out and like crustulating, whatever,
it's
underwater,
like boiling the water that it comes into contact with.
That was an incredible image, and super like kinetic and like crunchy, like tangible.
Yes,
But the other one I was talking about is just like, it's more of a painterly image where it's just like you're seeing an above shot of some kind of like surface covered with a little bit of water, but with like water bubbling out of some holes and then like kind of like spraying out. And just I don't know, about something about it just like pushed my buttons in like a very sort of just like textural way.
Yes. But that's such a good example of what I'm talking about in sort of the great pleasure of seeing some of these images. There's a lot to sort of latch onto. But what about you, Nathan?
For me, my choice was going to be the lava underwater.
Cool.
Hardening in real time, cooling and hardening, and I had never seen anything like that before. But I'll throw in an extra. it's in both films. The birds, there's these birds, I don't know if they're cormorants or whatever, but these birds that dive under the water to get the fish. And we're watching this from underwater at this cloud of fish that's circling, and these jet streams of birds are just coming in suddenly. You know, it's kind of terrifying if you're a fish, obviously. Yes. It's so beautiful. Like it's the kind of, I guess, photography that we would say, like, yeah, you could see that on planet Earth or whatever. And
yes.
fine.
In fact, I would have reacted more like positively to it if I hadn't already seen like almost that exact like shot in Planet Earth.
Oh, it's in there? Okay.
Yeah, because they So I mean, it's not the same shot literally, but it's the same kind of perspective of these birds diving into the water and coming down. Now, it's interesting. That's a good contrast between the tone of the two films. Not tone overall, but of that scene. If I remember correctly, in the short version, that scene is more like wondrous, right? I could be misremembering. Yes,
right.
But in the second version, it's very ominous and like this is death. Just like it's like you might as well be seeing like nuclear missiles dropping on like a landscape or something. It has the same vibe.
And that leads me to another observation that I wanted to make, is that it's amazing the expressiveness of some of these sequences. You know, we keep talking about a nature documentary, and like, yes, sometimes those can be very expressive, but usually it has to be aided by, you know, like the story that's being told, you know, so you have the voiceover sort of showing like the mating ritual and then the conflict and then the whatever, you know. But here it's so often just with like glances. Dude, I did not know that like fish's eyes could be so expressive. There's an awesome shot of this like octopus that we just are looking into its eye, like its single eye for like a really long time, like straight into the camera. And it's like, I'm seeing this thing's soul, you know, before it sort of slithers away.
And there's the shot of like the dead fish floating too.
Yes. It has like a chunk. First, what's great is we first see this fish or a fish like it, you know, this kind of fish sort of, you know, merrily swimming on its way. And then the next shot is like this seal, and we don't see the bite happen. We just see the fish floating with a chunk of it missing. And it's got this completely, you know, dead expression in its eyes.
Dude, but what happened expression.
Yeah, but there's like this shock because it's got this dumb, you know, like open mouth, you know. And
right.
But I find it like so relatable somehow, you know, like it's like when life just totally catches you off guard, you know?
Well, you earlier, James, said to what end, you know, right? And so that brings us to the question of the voiceover, because if this film's only goal were to provoke wonder, it could do that quite well without the voiceover, you know? So the question is like, what does the voiceover contribute on top of just like telling us to like wonder more, you know?
You should be wondering.
Oh, you're going to make me just jump into it?
Going to play their cards first. Well, so listeners...
It's a Mexican standoff.
We knew that there was a little bit of a difference of opinion here. So, Nathan, I don't know. Maybe we'll start with you. Yeah. What do you make of the voiceover generally? And then, in particular, you know, is there one that you prefer, or I don't know? Yeah, you answer it how you will.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So I'm gonna break this up along lines of like writing, and then performance, and then we'll say overall. And I'll do this, you know, kind of in a little prissy. But I liked the writing of Cate. Okay, gosh, it's tricky. Okay, I don't. Overall, I found the voiceover distracting in both versions, and I wish it wasn't in either version. I found in the IMAX version, I found the purpose of it to be more. I was more on board with kind of what it was trying to do with the intention of like this philosophizing around like, you know, why are we here and so on.
Good.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. I think that's very, you know, Malick wheelhouse. But there was too much of it in my opinion, and it just was kind of, it felt wallpapery to me in that way. And I didn't think Pitt's performance was particularly good.
Sure.
I felt like
I'll agree with that.
It just was not what it didn't have that. It wasn't evoking the sense that it was wanting to.
Yeah, I agree on that too.
In Blanchett's, in the Life's Journey, I definitely found the voiceover distracting because it goes away for long stretches, and you just get caught up in the symphony of the images and the sound design. We haven't talked about the sound design, but the sound design of the films are, astounding. So I mean, the film is so immersive, right?
Yes.
On that score. Every time Blanchett's voice comes back, and I think she does a marvelous job performance wise. I think I would love to hear her do another Malick voiceover in a different context. But I found it distracting, and it just, I wanted to just be immersed in nature, and then that leads me to my final issue, which I think we're, I definitely, I think I'm not alone in this. The content of Blanchett's narration in the long version, I definitely did not find particularly inspiring.
Oh, poo-poo.
Or interesting. And I'll let somebody else kind of take the baton on that.
Go
ahead.
No, I definitely prefer the Blanchett voiceover. Notwithstanding a few moments in the Brad Pitt version that I did quite like, and I've already mentioned the whales. That's maybe the best bit. But I think that the Life's Journey longer cut works better for a lot of reasons. And I think that the narration is part of it. I think that the gripping sense that's created from the outset is in part due to the narration. And I would be curious to watch a version of this that totally excised the narration. Maybe I wouldn't miss it, but I don't think that it's necessarily a problem that it oftentimes does fade into the background. I think that there is a kind of immersion that's created with the narration as well. Granted, that goes away periodically, but when it is back and we're maybe not listening to every word or hanging on every word in the same way that in some of these, visual sequences, I'm not paying attention to every crest of a wave, but I'm feeling sort of a overall impression, and I'm maybe latching on to an image here or a word there. This was what the effect was for me. Now, you could say that this is a deficiency of the narration, like you're not even paying attention to it. You're zoning, you're tuning it out. But I don't think so. I think that I'm very aware of it when it's happening. I
wouldn't say this is the first film that Malick has used voiceover in that way either, right? Like, would you say, like, I would say in the New World, there's moments where it does kind of fade into the background, and that it's not necessarily a problem.
Right. And I don't think it's the last time that he's going to use voiceover in this way. But it's certainly like the most pronounced here. There is a kind of a maximalist approach, I think, in the Cate Blanchett voiceover. Whereas in the Brad Pitt, it's more economic, it's more direct, it's more focused. Sometimes I think in the Cate Blanchett voiceover, it's more scattershot. It's throwing a lot of things at you. It's even more sort of montagey, sometimes even paradoxical, contrasting images, So yeah, I think that all of that creates a kind of impression that to me is very successful and immerses me in a different way.
Mm-hmm. So we haven't talked at all about like what they're saying yet. And I'm not like super going to bat for like either of these scripts. But in the short version, what I felt like is it kind of points the audience in a couple of suggestive directions with some classic metaphysical questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? There's a lot about the good, and it doesn't like give you all the answers or anything like that, but it kind of gives you the sense at the end, for example, he calls his child a child of the good, born to the light, yourself a light. And so there's this sense there is this transcendent good that everything comes from. And my impression, I don't know if I could prove this with, analysis of the text, nor do I intend to do that. But my impression watching the first one was like, yes, this is like a transcendent source for all of these things that we're seeing. So you referred to the Blanchett version as a more phenomenological approach.
This was off record, but I think Thomas is splitting hairs a little bit because he was poo-pooing it for being pantheistic and saying things of God that can't be attributed to God, or saying things of nature that can only be attributed to God. And I think that this is a failure to meet the film where it's at. And so I did use the term phenomenological because, right, we know that Malick is really into Heidegger, for example. And I think that the Cate Blanchett voiceover can be seen in this way as a kind of descriptive, phenomenological, poetic device rather than something that's definitive or trying to, propose something in the same way that maybe there's a stronger proposition in the IMAX version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it wasn't so much that I felt that there was a stronger proposition in the IMAX version as that maybe it clears the playing field. The playing field is a little more clear for you to go and seek more, whereas there were fewer conflicting propositions, I guess is how I would put it, rather than that, like it sort of feeds you the answers. Whereas, and again, I'm not going to get into like a detailed like textual analysis, but I just want to read like a couple of like indicative lines from the Cate Blanchett. So first of all, it starts out, the entire thing, I think we can say is addressed to Mother. Now, the question of like what that means is an open one, but I think we've got one narrator, right? Like, and one object of that narrator, so to speak, which could represent a number of different things. And the narration, by the way, I think sometimes it says I, sometimes it says we, sometimes it seems to represent an individual person, sometimes the human race. And I would even say sometimes like creation itself, because it is sort of creation or create the recipient of creation, speaking even during the stages of evolution of its sort of experience, so I would say even just like life, created life, speaking, but with like a modern, maybe like a fully conscious person, like expressing all of those stages in thought. So the first reference we get to mother, I believe is, it strikes me as an allusion to the famous passage, I think in the Book of Wisdom, about this like feminine wisdom principle that existed and played with God before the foundation of the world, whatever the exact quote is, I don't remember. Mother, you walked with me then before there was a world. So we've got this mother. So immediately I was kind of set up to think of this like as Sophia or something. I wonder if Malick's into Sophiology or any of that kind of stuff. And then there's stuff like creating yourself in ever-changing shapes, which could be said like, okay, God is making things in his image, so that's a poetic way of saying that. How do I reach you? You, the good towards which all things aspire, beyond time, beyond sorrow. And then there's questions like, Mother, what do I love when I love you? And then, oh, Mother, the tears you've wept, the scenes you've looked on, love poured out, the strivings, hopes. And then the end, time goes back to her source. I don't know if the source is supposed to be this mother or not. So those are just a few of the lines that are said. And what I kind of felt about it was that, yeah, it's true. It's definitely possible that this is kind of, none of these are asserted as truths, but as kind of like different essays into finding like what is the source of everything that I'm experiencing and seeing around me. And at sometimes this is said to be kind of transcendent and before time, before the cosmos, and sometimes this is said to be more immanent and sort of like maybe the source of life not in a transcendent immaterial sense, but as within creation, whatever the source of life within creation, the origins of life might be, Mother Nature kind of like generating more of itself. So it's not that it has to be pantheistic, but I also felt like, well, if these aren't taken as assertions, then I'm not sure how much it really adds for me. it just feels like, I don't know. I guess it feels kind of obvious or something.
Yeah.
I guess this is the question of what does the voiceover actually add to the experience besides the sound of a human voice and whatever rhythm and texture that creates.
I think that if you look at the kind of the hermeneutic, what I'll call the hermeneutic of the film is so much about this turn to the primitive, to the sources, to the origin, the primeval.
Right.
And so I think, and I have this term on my mind because of a recent audiobook that I did, but if you look at this in terms of natural religion and the questions that are sort of at the site of first contact with nature, first contact, I think that that's one way of understanding these questions that might not be, definitive propositions, so much as, essays, excursions, the groping in the darkness that is characteristic of a kind of preamble of faith. I don't think that this voiceover would have been appropriate really to the project for it to be something more in the line with, say, Knight's Cup, that has sort of more definite religious connotations. We get stuff from the Pilgrim's Progress, or
we do get that in the music a little bit, because there is a piece towards the end where it's the prologue of the Gospel of John being sung in Latin.
Yes, but notably that doesn't come until the city sequences, really. That's right. So it's so even there, it's a little bit in the timeline.
Yes,
right.
Agreed.
So I'm kind of looking at it in terms of the voiceover is decidedly pre-revelation. It's like a sort of decidedly primitive stance that the voiceover is taking in man's encounter with nature and with himself. I think that the emotional climax of the film is captured in that image of the early man looking at himself in the reflection. And that if you understand all of the voiceover in terms of this groping in the dark, this seeking, and the kind of questions that naturally arise in this contact with nature, I think you can also see the benefit that is possible here with this kind of a project. I think that, especially for those of us who are on the other side of of authenticated revelation, we are perhaps able to see anew some element of our faith or some aspect of the wonder that is covered over or taken for granted in this inheritance, this inheritance of the faith that we have, and I'm not saying in any particular doctrine. I'm talking about in our reception of it, in our sort of taking it for granted.
Familiarity.
So I think that this is what my sense is, that this is what Malick is interested in, is in this sort of this first contact with God, basically. And that if I can kind of enter into that, there's like a little reverse engineering maybe, that I can, that can actually edify me spiritually.
And how do you think that, as you put it, primitive perspective, though, lines up with the fact that this is a film based on a modern scientific account of the origins of life and the cosmos?
It's using,
so through and through. I mean, it's thoroughly. If you don't believe in evolution, you're probably not going to dig this film, except for it has a bunch of pretty pictures. Yeah, a large chunk of it, anyway.
I think that it's using a kind of language of scientific materialism, to show that there's nothing to be afraid of in the cosmos, that all things are bound up with the glory of God, So I think that that's one of the things that comes through, is that this is a Malickian nature documentary. It's one where everything is charged with the divine.
Yeah.
and with the existential and with this question, like love is pulsing through the cosmos.
Yeah.
And that's like, whoa.
Right.
Whoa.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and that was something that I thought about watching both versions, just sort of like love as a principle that exists in nature. And love is God. Now, we don't have readings from the Gospel of John overlaid in the voiceover, right? But we have something more primitive, a more primitive articulation of this instinct, this intuition. And I find that reawakens for me something of the wonder, the wondrousness of it, because you can tell me however many times God is love, and I can become dead to that, you know? So I just don't think it should be so easily discounted. You know, I get that there are some formulations here that aren't philosophically precise, that if they showed up in a scholastic, you know, treatise, we would take issue with them. But in the same way that you look at like Heraclitus or, you know, any of the ancient philosophers, Pythagoras, the Stoics, and you see things that are clearly incorrect, you recognize that there's an intuition here of something and that it's proceeding from an experience. And so that's why I use the phenomenological, you know, reference.
Yeah,
here.
I might relate it to the earliest people who thought, you know, everything came from fire or something like that.
Right. And that's also why I don't think that there's any problem if any contradictions emerge in the voiceover. You know, I think that this groping, this ambiguity, this imprecision is actually a feature of what Malick is doing here and not a bug, you know?
Yeah, no, I can believe that that's the intention. So I guess for me, you know, I kind of asked like, okay, so what is this actually doing for the audience? You know, I think modern people are very comfortable with the idea that like, you know, the whole like we're all stardust kind of idea, like a sort of a poetic gloss overlaid upon like scientific materialism, such that like we can talk about the universe in different ways, but it's all ultimately kind of materialistic and immanent. And the net, without even saying that like all of these are assertions of fact, you know, the result for me is a kind of like getting stuck or like allowing the viewer a kind of like complacence in these kind of like conflated ideas.
I agree with that, but
yeah.
I don't think that that's a problem. Like, I don't think that Malick is setting out to try to do more than that, right?
Yes, but
if you want to come in with a kind of complacency, then that's as far as you'll go, and I think that that's okay.
In the Brad Pitt version, what it feels like to me is that the question is still very much open, that maybe a direction has been pointed, but that you'll still want to like really ask this question seriously. Whereas with the Cate Blanchett narration, what I feel like is ultimately we've got kind of like a mood that's been set. Like, again, it is a kind of like a mood of wonder, an experience of some kind of like vaguely nurturing force, which of course there are questions also about the why is there suffering and stuff in both. And I don't think either of them are really answered in either film, and that's fine. But what I feel like is we're kind of just like sitting in this soup in the of sort of suggestive ideas in the second one, and then the longer one, I mean, and then the first one, there I feel like there's a little bit of like a little bit more of a dynamism that you're left with to think about more or to look for more than just being like, yes, we are in this nurturing cosmos, yes, and who knows what it is.
Well, yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. And if you want to argue that it's your preference, you know, that you prefer the IMAX voiceover, that's fine. But I think that, yeah, the second one does create something that I think is a little more immersive, a little more suggestive, a little more phenomenological descriptive, and that I can kind of tune out from time to time, but that every once in a while something will catch. And I don't think that accusations of like pantheism or whatever are really sort of like engaging with the work on its own terms. Like I don't think it's. I
can go along with that probability. Yeah, and by the way, I do think the Cate Blanchett performance is better.
Yeah,
more interesting.
I think there should be a cut of Lord of the Rings that puts this right at the beginning before the prelude. Yeah.
Well, it's I think for me then. What I come back to just as far as my personal experience is that I don't necessarily find that the content-wise this voiceover adds much to me, because ultimately the sum of it does kind of feel like, okay, yes, reality is wondrous, and I could have gotten that just from the images and the sounds. So I would love to see that. I don't want to just watch it with the sound off because I want the sound and the music, but I would love to see a voiceoverless version and see how that works, because I do think the questions of like, certainly the questions of suffering or like death, those are all raised without voiceover just as well. So yeah.
But I do like the sort of unorthodox formulations that we get, not because I agree with them, discreetly, like creating yourself in ever-changing shapes is something that I would find very alarming in the context of like a homily. But here I actually find it's very fruitful, because I'm taking that sort of, let's call it like a kind of pagan or natural religion description, and I'm trying to extrapolate from that, like what is the impression, what is the phenomenon that's being described, and how does that relate to my experience with God, who has revealed himself, and I think that's a fruitful thing.
Just so not talking about the voiceover at all, but just talking about what the film covers on a cosmic scale. Do you guys find it sufficient or satisfying to kind of to portray the sort of the beginning, evolution, human history just completely skipped over, and then like the end of the world? I appreciate that he included that, but do you find that like I guess I would ask that, like, as a story, not like wondering at the universe, but as a story, do you find this to be a satisfying story of the universe? Just like it happened, it's wonderful, human beings were there, kind of skipped over like anything in human history that like might lend meaning to this, and then like it just ends, and it wasn't great that it happened. What do you think about like the project of the parameters that Malick has set? Let's even set aside the fact that he's a Christian of some kind, and let's not put those expectations on him just because he's a Christian. But what do you find about this? Like ultimately, basically like a scientific look from the perspective of like the story that it tells about the world. I don't know if that was a coherent question.
I found it satisfying watching it. Now maybe that's partly because I was reading, as you said we shouldn't do, but I was reading, Malick's Christianity, particularly the Christianity that we see in the Tree of Life,
right.
in there. So I wasn't, panicking that it wasn't. But yeah, no, I found it satisfying on its own terms in that sense. And I like the way you frame it as as this kind of scientific odyssey,
Do you think that this does anything that wasn't already done by the sequence in the Tree of Life, but with like a greater human context? Does it really accomplish anything that wasn't already accomplished in some way by that sequence from like a sort of a substantial overall perspective? Obviously, this is a wonderful aesthetic experience. I'm glad I got to see it. But
I'll put it this way: if this film didn't exist, I don't think I would ever have any inkling of missing it.
Sure.
Which I mean, maybe I put that the wrong way.
It sounds very bad.
It does. Well, when I like, I'm really happy it's there, but to me, it doesn't feel. It's the only this is the only Malick project to me that doesn't feel critical to him as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
If I could put it this way, like if it it sounds awful to say this, if it disappeared, I wouldn't miss it the way that I would miss even, a work that like Song to Song, which I think a lot of people consider to be maybe the most minor Malick out there. To me, like there's still something very, very important going on.
Yeah.
In his films about humans that I don't quite see to the same extent.
But I think that's probably going to be true for any filmmaker anytime something like this is done. I think that we are just so keyed to stories and storytelling that we're always going to miss it when it's not there, and it's not really here. There's not really a story to be told, and so you kind of have to evaluate it on those terms. I think that it's very successful as an experimental, let's call it documentary, but totally. it that doesn't really do it service. So I think that if you just consider it as an experimental film, it's definitely up there, top experimental films I've ever watched,
But that I don't know, isn't that bracketing, like, isn't that kind of putting it into its own little,
I think that's appropriate,
minor league?
I think that's appropriate because it's
an experiment niche. By definition is like sort of not for its own sake in a way, right? It's like to discover something that will then be used elsewhere.
Right.
But the problem is he had already done the thing, the actual application.
But these things are happening contemporaneously, and there's a different project, right? I mean, he's trying to do something on camera that has not been done, and it's this tracking of the history of the universe, that's awesome. What a cool, ambitious project.
Well, at the same time, sorry to interject, when he conceived the project originally in the 70s, it hadn't been done except for 2001. But in the time since, we haven't talked about these films, but the films like Koyaanisqatsi and its whole kind of related, I don't know if do you guys know, there's a film called Koyaanisqatsi and sort of a related cycle of films, and then there's another one by the same filmmaker. I'm blanking out his name, but he made a film in the 90s called Baraka. And so these kind of two cycles of films are very much about like time, and Koyaanisqatsi is famous for bringing that time lapse, like cityscape time lapse photography into the mainstream, where we see that in everything now. But that was the first time I think that it had been used in like a major documentary kind of thing that everyone saw in like the 80s. And I don't know, like I in some ways I kind of feel like what made this maybe really fresh when Malick was first thinking about it, a lot of those ideas were picked up by other filmmakers and run with, which is where I think if I'm disappointed by the film, it's precisely because we didn't. And James, I just want to be very clear, like your defense of your kind of phenomenological reading or a historical reading is I think the far better of a defense than anything I could have ever. Like I think it's an excellent defense of the film.
Thank you
and
very
I'm going to be thinking about it. Like you've changed how I see the film already. So I want to be clear about that. But I think that other filmmakers had picked up this kind of like scientific, a religious kind of thing that he's doing here, and I to be clear, I think I still prefer this to those other films, even though they have their wonders as well. But I think there's a missed opportunity to really take a Christian to really tell this story of the cosmos in a Christian sense in more detail than he does in the Tree of Life.
Sure, yeah, that'd be cool.
And I think that's a missed opportunity, and that's really at the heart of my discontent with the Cate Blanchett voiceover. Again, I'm not sure if I agree with the idea that the claim that it's pantheistic per se, but I do think it's unsatisfying, particularly in the mother focus. If Malick was kind of going back and forth between mother and father as kind of terms addressing the source of the good, I could definitely see I wouldn't have.
Of course, that might create other cosmological questions. Right?
Yeah,
you got a mother and a father.
But the fact that the narration is very, very insistent that it is mother only, I think it is. It's not something that can just kind of be just reasoned out of, and I think it does. Related to that, the way the voiceover functions in the film compared to every other Malick voiceover has a psychological grounding to it. We understand there's a subjective grounding to it. There's a character.
Yeah.
We're not seeing the objective voice.
Right.
And I like your reading of it, James. I think there's a lot there, but it's very hard in the moment when you're watching it to not automatically take that as a kind of objective. It's just the objective voice of how are we to receive this, and I think there's a problem with that. And whether that's reflective of Malick's own views, I don't know. But it's not. Yeah, I'd say from an orthodox Christian point of view, small o. It's not satisfying. Yeah. And so that's going to always hold back my pleasure, in the whole thing.
We talked a little bit about, whether this is redundant in any way. And that was another of my, I don't think I said this before, another of my thoughts about the voiceover is that I didn't feel like it was doing much that I hadn't already heard in Malick voiceovers in sort of content or much in function, except for the fact that it's much more generalized, much more vague. And sometimes I do feel that when it has, like you said, when it has a particular grounded human referent, even if the voice is saying things that are super vague, we can make more of it in a way because of the context. I mean, you were saying you didn't even remember what moments different things were said. But I also think that because of the beauty of the images, now not everybody gives Malick's voiceover a pass, but I have generally been willing to give him a certain pass while making my occasional wry remark, in terms of the voiceover and it's sort of relative vagueness of content in a lot of his later films because of the beauty of the images. And I just wonder if it's I wonder if I actually should give it a pass because the images are so beautiful. But the other thing was just that there weren't very many surprises. There weren't really. I kind of already knew what the voice was going to say before it said it in a way, and the style that it was going to have.
For me, it's in how that informs the way I'm looking at the image. You know, so it does something to me as a viewer in the moment. Yes. So it's not that I'm looking for a one-to-one connection or, walking away with any particular, oh yeah, that was good. Oh yeah, creating yourself in ever-changing ways. Oh, it's informing the way that I'm looking at the image, and it's changing it dynamically. And there is this kind of, mating that's going on, and so I like that. I like Malick's voiceover. I like it.
But shouldn't there be some kind of should I be able to just know what it's going to be before it even starts? I guess not in terms of just the overall kind of vibe of it. I guess is there a point where it gets played out in Malick?
Yeah, maybe, but
I don't think ordinarily. I don't think so because again, if he's grounding it in a subjective character,
I think that really helps.
If he's embracing the subjectivity of it, I think it's always going to be fresh.
Right.
I think it only gets problem, as I was saying, when it's sort of, at least taken to be objective.
Listen, sometimes you want to just zone out in front of a movie and just let it work on you. Okay, this
zone out.
Yes.
What is
sometimes
this?
It's a different way of watching, and it's dude, I think that sometimes you just want to have fun watching.
Well, I do, but I'm just
movie,
wondering. But I don't know that the voiceover made me have any more fun than I otherwise would have. That's my question. Like, I'm able to go.
I do,
I'm able
because
to go
that
with
was
the fun
one of the
idea.
things that blew my mind when I first saw Malick. Okay, when I first saw To the Wonder, my mind was utterly shattered by these voiceovers. And that was my introduction to Malick, and I was just like, give me more of this. And so I'm partial to the Malick voiceover.
Mm-hmm.
I like what it does. I will always be a apologist for Malick, but also for this way of viewing movies, where like you kind of just like surrender to it a little bit and just kind of like let it work on you. It's a different attitude than one takes when you're sort of like in a story or analyzing characters. You know, it is something that's a little bit more like you let go and you start to just like bathe in it. And this sounds very weird, but it is a weird way of watching weird movies, you know?
Right.
What can I say? I went to art school, okay?
I don't know how we got from like the narration in this particular film is or isn't good to like where all of Malick voiceovers are on trial. Like, you know, that's, to be clear, that's not. I
wouldn't put all of them on trial.
He's saying he doesn't.
He's putting it on
should
trial.
Should I give Malick's voiceovers a pass? Dude,
we've been hoodwinked.
Malick's voiceovers give you a pass, okay?
They didn't bring any evidence to court. There's no specificity. I overall, I've been willing to. It just makes me, when I see it in this extreme a form, it like makes me question whether like I've been too easy on it, or too like willing to accept the vagueness in other films. But it's fine. Sometimes.
Well, I think it draws our attention. I think we have to look at what the specifics of each one,
right.
And really judge, judge it kind of on its own terms.
But it's also interesting that like some of the characterization in the movies we're about to discuss becomes less and less also. You know what I mean? So that like it also becomes less specific in some ways, even in the human movies.
Yes.
Forthcoming.
Yep.
So like that's, having seen a couple of those already, I'm also thinking about it in those terms. Okay, so we should probably wrap up, right? I didn't expect it to go more than an hour actually, but this was good. I'm glad we discussed this. I don't think we've done an experimental,
not like this. Yeah. I think
film discussion before. Yeah, so I'd say it's worth watching, especially if you like Malick. If you can get, I would probably skip the short version, despite my issues with the narration and the longer version. I would just go straight to the long version on this, I think.
Yeah.
If you thought I was critical of Malick in this episode, just wait. It'll be on different grounds, but wait until the next one.
Yeah, maybe you thought I was an apologist. You just wait.
I think you're gonna be have a hangdog look on your face for the next episode.
I think that's what you thought I would have for this episode.
No, I didn't.
And
what we're saying, everybody, is like
stand unvanquished.
The blows have only begun. There will be blood all over the screen next time, so you make sure you don't miss it.
Well, there's some moral issues with the next films that I think
it'll be interesting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. All right. Okay, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Nathan. And we'll see you next time.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.